Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. There is a phenomenon of violence in schools that we are seeing a little more of. The question some people ask is whether or not it's because we have mobile phones to see it, or whether or not this is something that has been going on for a while. We discuss this and more with clinical and community psychologist Charles J.P. Collier. How are you doing, sir? Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Truly appreciate it.
And even before we get to the topic at hand or the meat of the matter, I want to get your take on individuals seeking mental health in a manner that kind of helps to destigmatize it a bit. Thanks.
So, that's an ongoing challenge. It's been a challenge for quite some time. Part of the issue is the way that as a society we frame mental health. My running joke is that we have a binary view of mental health. You're mad or you ain't mad. And nobody wants to be in the mad category. And so frequently help seeking is interpreted to mean that I'm mad. And so in order to avoid that, people avoid seeking help. That's at least a piece of the problem, that stigma. It's a large societal stigma, but it also distills down to our self-stigmatizing. That is, that we have these views, these stereotypical views that we apply to ourselves. We didn't invent them, but we have inherited them. And part of the challenge is undoing those. I think that there's some movement with that. I think younger generations are more accepting of seeking mental health care and support. We do also have a gender difference. We men are far less likely to seek mental health care because we have a double stigma that we're dealing with. The stigma of being mad if we seek help, but also the stigma of being less mad if we seek help. That's a whole thing to unpack by itself. But
I remember one of my father telling me one of the worst baskets you could take in life is somebody telling you, if your name man, ... But even continuing on that though, and looking at the fact that there are levels and there are nuances to unpack, as you say, I'm grateful that you have, in your practice, engaged with adolescents and adults. Do you find there's a difference in the way that one, individuals would seek help, or two, even engage with you seeking mental help from those two broader groupings?
So it's slightly more complicated than that. Because one of the challenges that we have is even when people are willing to seek help, access is difficult. We do not have enough providers of mental health care. We do not have enough access available. We do not have enough access that is affordable. There have been efforts to improve that, but there needs to be more effort because the need is great. Notwithstanding that, it does intersect with what happens with adults versus adolescents, but notwithstanding that, adults are more likely to seek therapy of their own volition, of their own will. They've got usually a crisis point in their lives. Something has gone very much the way they would not like. And they have applied whatever strategies, means, resources that they have at their disposal and that they know of. It hasn't worked. And that's usually the point at which they are willing, again, because of our stigmatization of mental health care. That's the point at which people are willing to at least try it. Adolescents, in some instances, are seeking care of their own will. And sometimes when they are having to wrestle with their parents or guardians to get the care because the older generation is still carrying the stigma while the younger people are more open to it. Um, Sometimes adolescents are still themselves carrying stigma, um, much less so than with adults. But what also happens is that adolescents are also much more likely to be forced into some kind of um, care, um, therapy, or some other kind of intervention, typically by their parents, sometimes by state actors, children's authority, or um, the juvenile justice system, or something along those lines. And that definitely makes a difference. The old joke about therapy, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer to which is just one, as long as the light bulb is willing to change. Um, and so that becomes a significant issue because when children are pushed into therapy, often it's a real struggle because they don't want to be there. Um, so there's certainly concerns and considerations with that. Hopefully, part of what will happen for us is that we move more and more toward an understanding of the role of therapy, the role of mental health care that is not necessarily therapeutic, and even the role of mental health care that is found by other means. That there needs to be a sort of growing understanding. There needs to be a growing education of the public about what this really means, because it doesn't mean you're mad or you're not mad.
And with that, I want to dive into I won't call it the meat of the matter, but you spoke about education and you even spoke about moving from it being an option of last resort because everything else hasn't worked. So I guess let me try this. To being something that is almost a first protocol. But how do we start to look at school violence through the lens of mental health? And I'll even ask, and just for the opening salvo from you, I'll ask if you put any credence to that, whether or not there's more or we're just seeing more because we have more content creators.
Both things can be true. And so I don't know that we can entirely parse out this or that. I think that there's good reason to believe that both are factors. I think that there's an intersection of the accessibility at this point to information that was not accessible when certainly you were growing up or I was. There was lots of violence in school. I went to two different boys' high schools in Trinidad and Tobago, and we had plenty of violence. This was as you can see from the salt and pepper. I think it's salt and pepper. That was a while ago, but there was plenty of violence then. But nobody had a cell phone. Nobody had Instagram or YouTube or Facebook or any other mechanism for sharing video. And so we would have to somehow translate what would it look like if there was Instagram and cell phone video um, in 1980. For me, it would certainly, there would be lots of video to share of violence. So that is a piece of the consideration. But I also do think that we have had an increasing rate of violent engagement within school systems for a variety of reasons that I hope we will address. And arguably one of the biggest relatively recent factors was the pandemic.
All right, and
That
I want you to elaborate on that, but we do so just after this break
Mhm.
because looking the way that people used to talk about AD and BC, I think we can almost insert the pandemic as this hard marker before and after that behaviors,
That's a
thought
great way to
processes,
talk about it.
paradigms have changed. So we do that after we return from the break. Stay with us. We return after this. Welcome back. We are speaking with clinical and community psychologist Charles J.P. Collier and looking at school violence. One of the factors just cited as having a part to play is the pandemic. Please elaborate on that, Mr. Collier.
So part of what happened with the pandemic, of course, was that school was shifted to online platforms, and there was not uniform access. That there were a lot of school-age children who did not have reliable access. And so just on that basis, there was a level of disengagement with school in general that has sort of resulted in school-based or academic challenges for a lot of children. They fell behind to a significant degree. And one of the things that is an established factor in school violence and other kinds of problems with school-age children is disengagement from the academic environment. And so the combination of frustration and experience of failure and disengagement would certainly exacerbate things. It would make things worse. So that is a factor, but what also transpired is that even those who had access didn't necessarily do well within the context of a virtual learning environment. There's some for whom that worked, but many found it really difficult to sustain engagement and to learn. And perhaps more than all of that, it meant that for a significant period of time, many school-age children were disconnected from social connection and engagement with their peers, with their teachers and mentors, and found themselves establishing a way of functioning in isolation. It is not a social environment, and it makes sense that people would not respond well when re-engaging with each other socially. The pandemic also meant that people were dealing with a lot of stressors, separate and apart from the school system itself. When there was a move towards prohibiting outdoor activities during the pandemic, I was, not just me, but a lot of people were very, very concerned. I was very vocal about it, that was not a good idea because outdoor activities are, for many people, their primary way of coping with various kinds of distress. And what that meant was that people were going to be stuck inside without a means of coping effectively, and that they were going to be inside with their families. I predicted very foreseeably an increase in domestic violence, in child abuse, and elder abuse. And there was globally that happened. And so that meant that children were at home in an academic setting that they didn't necessarily fare well in, or not having access to education at all, not having social connections, not having outlets, not able to engage in physical activities that is often an outlet for people emotionally. And perhaps faced with conditions at home where their parents and others were also under stress and might have been acting out, having quarrels, fights, arguments, you know, having their own episodes of depression, anxiety, suicidality, etc. And children were coping with this or dealing with this. And then they come back to school. That there was an explosion of violence is pretty much inevitable. That there were other problematic behaviors was also true, but those garnered less attention than the violence. The violence is sort of in your face and obvious, but there were other things that were happening as well that were really problematic.
Looking at that violence, I want you to speak to the potential of a shift in power dynamic on that return to school. And when I say shift in power dynamic, I mean between students and teachers. And this from the context of, I've heard anecdotal reports of individuals having to help miss or help Sue set up the Zoom link, how it is you're having the breakout rooms. So when you've come back to the physical classroom setting, teacher Sir Miss is no longer the avatar of all the information, especially if you've also been getting information from different places virtually on your own efforts.
There's definitely some of that that occurred. Um, you know, I have that power dynamic when I'm trying to do a Zoom class and the adolescents around and like, no, you need to do so and so. I'm like, I'm the old person who doesn't know how to fix the VCR. Um, I've become that person. Nevertheless, um, that dynamic was present, but I think perhaps even more was um, that some of the behavior that was exhibited not only by students, but also by teachers during the pandemic, because teachers were human beings who were also dealing with incredible stress and distress, facing the same kinds of things that students were dealing with, including illness, death of loved ones, anxieties, lack of access to their own ways of coping and managing. And so there was an uptick in teacher misconduct as well. I don't mean that every teacher was doing, craziness, but there were teachers who behaved in ways that matched um, different patterns of distress. There were teachers who checked out. There were teachers who um, became really anxious or aggressive or controlling. There were teachers who did the opposite and sort of stepped back and didn't really engage with the students at all, feeling very uncomfortable within this forced new environment. There were all sorts of things that happened. There was a lot that went wrong. And in all fairness, nobody could have adequately prepared for any of this. This was far beyond our even imagining of what the circumstances and conditions might be.
Now,
Um,
I'm glad that you agreed to us having another conversation because there's so much more that we can still get into. But in the 2 minutes that we have for this one,
hmm?
I want you to expand a little bit on what are some of the factors that might help determine how it is people respond to certain things? Is it background? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Why does the person X just check out and withdraw within themselves? Why does person Y decide they're going to lash out physically?
uh, that's an
And I
even more
know
complicated question.
it's not a binary
That's an even more
us equals
complicated
this,
question.
but I'm just asking for some of those possibilities, Stas.
So at least part of it is um, that we are mammals. And mammals, whether you believe in evolution or you have a theological creation view of things, um, there are certain biological realities of all mammals. All mammals have um, brains that at the root are focused on survival. And so for us as human beings, We have almost in a way two brains. At the base of the brain, we have what someone would refer to as the reptilian brain, um, that doesn't do any of the things that we think of as thinking. It keeps us alive. It focuses on regulating our heart rate and our rate of breathing and our body temperature. But it also is responsible for keeping us alive in the wake of physical threats to our lives. And so part of the brain has a series of responses to perceived physical threats. And that part of the brain develops first in the womb. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is the part of the brain that develops first. But even without evolution, just the development of the fetus in the womb, that part of the brain develops first. And then the more sophisticated parts of the brain that do all the things that we think of as thinking develop. And when we're faced with threats, that sophisticated, elegant part that thinks of, witty words and that is able to do analysis and, in Trinidadian terms, will come up with picong and fatigue and all of that kind of stuff. That part of the brain essentially goes offline. And the older reptilian survival focused brain runs the show. And that's the part of the brain that is responsible for our startle response. When people talk about a deer in headlights, the first thing when we perceive that there may be some danger, that response, right, where we just pause and we listen and we look around to see if there's a threat. If we do perceive that there is a threat, we then move to flight mode, where we run. That translates to what we call anxiety. If we don't have open egress, there isn't a way to simply run away, then we go to the next step, which is fight mode, where we may try to knock down the threat. That translates to anger. It's not like in, when you're watching movies where people are fighting back and forth for 15 minutes. Rather, the purpose of that is to get the threat out of the way enough to be able to get back into flight mode and run. And that translates to anger. If we don't get to that, we may get to the place where we feel trapped, where there doesn't seem to be any way out. Fighting won't help. Running is not possible. And then we go into a kind of collapse. Some people call it freeze mode. I don't know if that's the term that I would apply, but we shut down, and it's an actual biological process. The dorsal vagus nerve is stimulated, and it actually slows the heart rate down. And we shut down. We become immobilized. And it's a survival mechanism. You'd see it with prey animals where, they get chased down, antelope gets chased down by a lion or cheetah or something, and it gets pulled down, and it appears to be dead. But if the animal that has brought it down moves away far enough for a little while, it may jump up and run. That's the purpose of it.
And speaking about and speaking about purpose of it, jump up and run. The time has run from us. So I'm very glad that you I almost submitted yourself to having a second conversation. So we will do that. But for this first one, Charles J.P. Collier, clinical and community psychologist, we thank you very much. On behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for tuning in.